All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Jen Rogers. I'm co-director of the National Coalition for Sexual Health. I'm here with our fantastic coalition team, including Susan Gilbert, Molly Carmody, and Holly Doggett. We are so happy to be hosting our first open forum. Many of you have requested that we get together more frequently to really discuss key sexual health topics and to engage in discussion with one another. And that is what this open forum is intended to do. If all goes well, we hope to do more in the future. So please keep your eye out, and our evaluation at the end, we're going to ask for other topics that you might be interested in. So keep that in mind as we move forward. As you'll see, when we came on, all our lines are muted. That's because our presenter is going to talk first, but we really encourage you to come off mute, turn your cameras on if you feel comfortable, and ask questions and join in during the discussion period. In terms of the discussion, on the bottom button, there's reactions, and I think there's a raise hand. If you want to raise your hand just so Shan can help sort of moderate the questions, that would be really helpful. And also, I know some people are more comfortable with the chat feature, so feel free to chat in your questions. We'll make sure that Shan sees those, and we'll hopefully get to all of your questions and comments. So now that I've taken care of some of the logistics, I'm really thrilled today to have Dr. Justin Lehmiller from the Kinsey Institute and sexuality educator Shan Boodram, that they've been able to join us today. Many of you probably saw their excellent presentation at our last annual meeting, and I joked with them that we would have to do a part two, and here we are. So I'm glad that they both were eager and able to join us. So as we know, the focus of today is COVID-19, sex, relationships, and now we're 14 months into this pandemic. What does this mean? Justin's going to present findings from some national surveys that he's done, including a new survey that was just released a few weeks ago. And Shan has a significant public following, so she's going to share her on-the-ground insights as well. I'm now so thrilled to introduce Shan Boodram. She's one of our steering committee members. She's a certified sex educator, a dating coach, a relationship expert, and now a mom. And she's also a best-selling author and the host and executive producer of Quibi's #1 daily show, Sexology with Shan Boodram. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Shan. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I am thrilled to be here for 41 incredible minds in this space. And when you think about it, we are historians coming together to talk about a moment in time that is going to be discussed for centuries to come. And everybody here is playing such a massive role in furthering a discussion around intimacy, which there's a lot of bad things that have happened as a result of the pandemic, but I think the one plus side is that people are now more focused than ever about the importance of the quality and quantity of their close relationships. And I have talked more about sex in the media, and I know Justin probably does this 40 times a day, but I've had more requests than ever before because all of a sudden, when there's nothing else to distract us, we realize this is truly what matters. And the work that we're doing really matters. And like Jen was saying, everyone's voice here today matters. And so this is a cameras on, mics on opportunity for us to have a meeting of the minds. I'm excited to go back and read the chat afterwards too. So if you have a thought starter as something comes up, we want to throw to you. And to encourage that, in addition to this being an open forum, we're going to have tons of breaks to really encourage that. So Justin has put together his slides in 3 different sections. So we're going to focus on the past. As Jen was saying, we are 14 months in this. I don't know if that sounds nuts to you. It still feels like 4 days ago. And I've had a whole baby since then, because how can a year have gone by with this weird normal that we've all been faced with? But we are here, we're standing, we're thriving the best that we possibly can. So in the past, when this pandemic first hit, Justin's going to have some reflections on that. Then we want you to pop on, tell us about what you saw in your organization or some of the things that you have noticed. Then he's going to talk about the present. Where are we at today? 14 months later, what can be said about the relationship between COVID-19 and intimacy? And then we're going to jump forward to the future predictions. What do we see going forward, and how, as we as a community, can come together to ensure that we can steer things in a healthier direction? Now, for the future part, we're going to have the most amount of time 4 reflections, because this is where we really want to know what you think needs to be done in order, again, to ensure a happy, healthy, connected, and safer sexual future. Now, before we jump into things, can I just fan out for a second and say that Dr. Beverly Whipple is with us today? And I have been reading about your work, and it is incredible foundational information. I didn't know you were part of the coalition. I need an autograph. My boobs are always available to be signed by you. Just tell me where I can come and I will bring all the markers. Now that I've gotten that fan moment out of the way, I am really, really thrilled to introduce Dr. Justin De La Miller, who has done incredible work in this field that I'm sure you've been reading about. He is in the news constantly as somebody who is right at ground zero, reporting things live as they come, collecting data and research. And we're so incredibly grateful to have this incredible mind here to steer this conversation. Dr. Layla Miller is a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. I have my copy. I officially got it after our last talk. It is fantastic. It's a resource that you're going to want to go back to. So shout out to you for making that. Previously, he taught at Harvard University, where he was honored with 3 teaching awards. His research focuses on casual sex, fantasy, sexual health, friends with benefits, and we should add to the list COVID-19 and the impact it's had on sex and sexuality. He runs the Pop Sex and Psychology and has appeared in leading media outlets and numerous cable and network television programs like Netflix and Dr. Phil, just to name a few. Justin, we would love to have you come forward. Thank you for the work that you do, and I'm excited for this presentation.
Thank you so much, Shan, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Coalition for having me. I'm excited to do the part 2 follow-up. I'm sorry that my background isn't quite as amazing as Shan's. I'm having a lot of Zoom background envy right now, but this is my office. This is what you get. So I'm really excited to talk to you all about what we've been doing at the Kinsey Institute over the last year, looking at the impact of COVID-19 on sex and relationships. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my slides here with you. As Shan said, they are split into 3 different sections, and we're going to start first by talking about the past and then move on to the present and future. So for those of you who attended the previous coalition talk, I talked a lot about this Kinsey Institute study that we conducted last year. It was longitudinal in nature. We started surveying people in mid-March of last year and followed them through November of 2020 because we really wanted to explore, what is the impact of this pandemic on people's sex lives and relationships. And in mid-March of last year, there were so many media claims and stories going around about what was going to happen, about there's going to be a future baby boom, about skyrocketing porn use, about increased sex toy sales, right? There were all of these reports going around. And so we wanted to test, what is actually happening inside of people's bedrooms? And also, what's the impact of social distancing and isolation rules on sexual behavior? So we started this longitudinal study and initially surveyed a little over 2,000 adults. You can see some of the sample demographics up there. It was pretty diverse with respect to age, going from 18 to 81. The sample was predominantly female identified and heterosexually identified, but pretty diverse with respect to sexual identity. Predominantly white, and most participants were living with a partner. So what we wanted to do was we gave people this really extensive survey about what's happening in their sex life, how does that compare to the year before, and how are people coping and adapting to their new circumstances. We really wanted to identify what are the common areas of difficulty and concern, and also who's doing really well and what can we learn from that. So I'm not going to talk too much about the results from the initial survey because I talked about that previously in the last talk and it's received a lot of media attention. So I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this, but the overall trend and takeaway from our initial study was that most people were more likely to report declines rather than improvements in both their sex lives and relationships. And you can see that as evidenced by the numbers that are up here. Much larger percentages of people reporting declines rather than improvements, but you also see significant numbers reporting no change. So the story of the pandemic and people's intimate lives was really a tale of different effects for different people. Some people didn't change much, other people really improved, other people declined. And there were some people who really seemed to be struggling more than others. In particular, the more stressed, anxious, lonely people felt, the worse their outcomes were. And it was also the case that people who were living alone seemed to be struggling a bit more than people in relationships. As for that baby boom that everyone talks so much about, we actually found that rates of both masturbation and partnered activity went down compared to their pre-pandemic levels. So people were less sexually active overall. But interestingly, there was this uptick in sexual experimentation. And just in that very early stage of data collection, 1 in 5 of our participants had already tried something new in their sex lives since the pandemic began, such as exploring their sexuality virtually, sharing and acting on their sexual fantasies with their partner, having sex in a new position or vocation. So despite the fact that there was this downturn in sexual behavior, it was also a period of sexual revolution for many people. And those who were trying new things were the most likely to report improvements in their intimate lives. In fact, they were 3 times more likely to report improvements than the people who didn't try anything new. Now, when we look across the year, when we collected our data, what we found was that masturbation and partnered sex went down initially, and they stayed low over the course of the year when we're looking at average levels compared to their pre-pandemic levels. However, averages often have the effect of obscuring individual variability. So although the average level didn't really seem to change over time, when you started looking more closely at the data, you could see that some groups of people in particular were showing more change than others. And one of the trends that came out was that the people who were less active initially became more active over time, and the people who were more active initially actually became less active over time. And that was true for both solo sexual behaviors as well as partnered sexual behaviors. And it's worth noting that the single biggest change we observed was among the participants who at the beginning of the study reported that they were single. So for example, in that initial time 1 survey, 72% of singles reported that they hadn't engaged in vaginal intercourse since the pandemic began. But by time 7, which is in November of 2020, only 44% were reporting that they had engaged in vaginal intercourse in the past month, right? So you see this big change in sexual behavior, particularly for single people, where the longer this went on, the more sexually active they became. And just a couple of other quick data points. We also saw similar patterns when we looked at porn use and online dating app use. We saw that these things decreased early on in the pandemic, but when you start looking at later waves of data collection, you see people reporting more online dating behavior and more pornography use. Also, reports of having a new sexual partner increased over time. So by midsummer, about 10% of our participants said that they'd had at least 1 new sex partner, but that increased to 18% by the final wave of data collection in November. It's also worth noting that of those who were single, a majority of them, in fact, 54% reported that they had at least 1 new partner over the course of this study, right? So again, we saw the biggest change in sexual behavior for singles, and especially as the pandemic wore on, they were more likely to report having new partners. It's also worth noting that as time went on, people reported fewer declines in their sexual and romantic lives and more improvements. So people did seem to be adapting, and they were becoming more sexually active as time wore on. So I'm going to pause right there so that we can talk a little bit about the past before we move into the present.
I think, like you said, this was one of the most fascinating talks that we had during the meeting last time, because everybody's observations are so unique in this way. And we're all trying to come up with that one boiled down talking point. So I thought it was really fascinating because we start off by saying that majority of people have assessed or said that their sex life has diminished as a result, or their intimate life has diminished. Then there's actually a lot of other hopeful stats that said that people were resilient. People who had a really tough time in the beginning, by the time that they were surveyed again late fall, were able to say that there were some improvements or that activity had gone up. So when we think about all of the various information that we've got here, is it fair to say that COVID-19 caused a decline in people's value around their intimate life or the quality of their intimate life? Or do you feel like people bounce back to around where they were before the pandemic?
Yeah, so there was certainly a decline initially, and for some people that has persisted even until now. So many people are still feeling too scared and anxious to go out and resume their normal dating practices or to engage in casual sex again. Whereas others, they've just progressively gotten more comfortable over time, or they've just kind of reached their limit in terms of, how much lack of intimacy that they can take in their lives. So, when I look across the entirety of the data that we have, it's discouraging in some senses when you see the negative impact it had on so many people, but it's also encouraging in the sense that we do see so much resilience and also so much adaptability, that people were willing to explore themselves sexually. And that included a lot of, solo behaviors where people were really exploring their sexuality for the first time. Some of our participants reported a change in their sexual identity because they were really exploring different aspects of the self that they had kind of pushed off to the side, but then really during the pandemic had a chance to explore that, which I think is really fascinating.
I want to give an opportunity for someone to jump on camera. So if anybody wants to throw their hand up, even if it's just to give a comment of what you noticed, that would be wonderful to add before we move on to the present. The thing that I noticed, I was fortunate enough to be working. I was working as of July of this year, and my job was to really talk to people about their experiences and be on the ground and get all these anecdotal experiences of who is struggling and who is thriving. And the thing that I found is that a lot of people who put off by the dating culture prior to COVID, in that it was extremely libertine, it was disposable. People were always looking for the next thrill, 4 first dates in a week. The fact that now things had slowed down and people were forced to take time to get to know each other, and there was actually more activity happening in the chats of dating apps and less pressure to immediately meet in person. Some people reported that they actually preferred the way that this changed the dating culture. Is it fair to say that people who weren't happy with the way that things were culturally going before, the trends before, may have actually found their footing in the pandemic?
Yeah, and I think our data helped to bear that out because we did see that there were concrete changes in the ways that people were approaching online dating. And for example, one of the big changes was that people reported having deeper conversations with their online dating partners than they ever did before in the past. So they were really taking some time to build some intimacy. And I think starting to recognize that you can build intimacy in a virtual environment. I think a lot of people just didn't see that as feasible before. And so that's a pattern and trend that I think is likely to persist as we go forward, where we're going to get something different out of online dating than we did before, where it's less superficial and more focused on intimacy.
So Molly said that any further thoughts on the finding that the porn use initially decreased? It's one piece that stood out and surprised me from your initial findings, especially because Pornhub actually came out with a statistic in around May that said that there was an increase in porn watching throughout the day, but maybe a decrease overall. So they found that at 3 p.m. there was higher spikes, but maybe less people were watching than they usually would in the evening. So can you give some reflection around the fact that people were alone? And so by virtue of that, it would seem like porn would spike, especially in the beginning when nobody was going anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, intuitively, it would make sense. And, I should also say that for the porn data, it's similar to the sexual behavior data where you see different things for different people. So there were some porn users in the very beginning of our study who were reporting a lot more usage than they had before the pandemic. And so that might be part of the reason why a lot of the porn sites were reporting spikes in traffic, was that maybe you had a smaller number of people using the platforms at much higher levels than they did before. And so it might not have been this overall reflection of, yeah, way more people on the site, but maybe you have people spending longer on the site than they did before. And I think, initially so many people were scared and stressed and didn't know what was happening. And we know that stress tends to put a damper on libido, makes people less likely to want to masturbate and to have sex. And so I think that was discouraging some people from solo play at the beginning. But as time went on, I think a lot more people started turning to masturbation as sort of a self-care technique and a way of actually coping with stress and relieving some of that anxiety that they were experiencing.
I think we can move on to present.
Sure. All right, let me reshare my slides here. So let's talk about what is happening right now. So earlier this year in January, the Kinsey Institute partnered with Cosmopolitan magazine to do a follow-up study on what is happening with sex and relationships right now. How are people feeling? And so this was a nationally representative US survey of 2,000 adults. And they focused specifically on the 18 to 45 demographics. So while this is a nationally representative sample, it's restricted in terms of age, specifically looking at that 18 to 45 demographic. And participants completed an extensive survey between 60 and 70 questions, looking at what's going on in their intimate life. And we found that people were thinking differently about relationships right now, but they're also thinking differently about sex. So what I'm going to share with you are some of the key findings. And if you've read the most recent issue of Cosmo, some of these might be familiar to you because they were recently featured in the latest issue. So when it comes to what people want from their relationships, we actually see the majority of singles now say that what they want next is a committed relationship. And further, about half are saying that commitment is even more important to them now than it was before. So we're seeing this shift away from desire for casual sexual relationships and toward more desire for committed romantic relationships, especially among that single population. We're also seeing significant numbers of people, around a third, who say that they want to wait longer to meet in person when they're interacting with somebody online. Right? So this goes back to what we were saying about online dating, where in the past it used to be pretty superficial. You'd swipe, you'd have a match, and people would meet in a pretty short period of time. But now people want to take longer to get to know the other person before they actually meet in person. And they also want to wait longer to have sex too, right? So this is something that I'm interested in exploring in another follow-up study that I'm working on right now is, in the past, we often talked about this so-called 3-date rule, where people would wait 3 dates before they went and had sex with somebody else. But people seem to want to wait longer than that now. So I'm curious as to what the new rules of dating actually are, if you will. Also, people say that living with a partner is more important to them now than it was before. So 43% of participants in the survey said that living with a partner is more important. We'll talk more about this in the future section, but in recent years, people have been living alone more and more, but we might be seeing a shift away from that. Also, 68% of respondents said that they're less likely to cheat in the future, which is a finding that I find to be really fascinating. We know that infidelity is really common. Between 1 in 4, 1 in 5 married couples report cheating on their spouse at some point in the course of their relationship. And in dating relationships, the numbers are even higher. But the majority of participants are saying, I'm less likely to commit infidelity in the future, right? Which is sort of tying in with this idea of reprioritizing commitment. And also among those who are engaging in video dating right now, the vast majority say that that's something they plan to continue. And so there's going to be this increased focus on video vetting your partner before you actually meet in person. People are also thinking differently about safer sex in this unique period in time that we're living in. So 2/3 of participants say they're less interested in having more than one sex partner at a time. And we also see, in terms of thinking about your own health and the health of your partners, this is something that's more at the forefront for people than it was before. So more than half of participants say they're more likely to cancel a date if they don't feel well. 51% of participants said they're more likely to use condoms in the future. I think this is really fascinating, right? Because we know that COVID-19 isn't a sexually transmitted disease, but it does seem to be having an impact on the way that people are thinking about safe sex and their willingness to use condoms in the future. That's particularly interesting in light of the fact that there's been a decline in condom use in recent years. And so how is COVID going to reverse that trend potentially? Also, about half of the participants said that, and we're specifically talking about people who are planning to seek new sexual partners this year, about half of them say it's very important for a partner to disclose their COVID-19 status. And 42% said that they're more likely to ask a potential partner about their physical health before agreeing to have sex. And for that question, it was a general question about physical health. It wasn't specific to COVID or to STDs. Interestingly, it's also worth noting that 30% of the participants said that COVID-19 is more of a concern to them than STIs in terms of having a new potential sex partner. So this increased willingness and interest in using condoms isn't just about concern about STIs. There seems to be this tying in with COVID and STIs together, where people are thinking more about the potential health of their partners and thinking about approaching sex in a safer way. But the overall trend lines and takeaways from this is that there seems to be less interest in casual sex, more interest in committed relationships, and this desire to take sexual relationships slower and take more sexual health precautions than they were taking before. So I'll turn it back over to you, Shannon.
It sounds like the work that everybody has been trying to do for decades and decades, all it took was a pandemic for it to actually land. Like when I'm listening to all of this, I'm keeping in mind the 5 action steps from the National Coalition of Sexual Health and all the objectives that it's set forth for people to prioritize their sexual health, prioritize intimacy, prioritize pleasure, prioritize consent. And I see all of that in the stats. So is the pandemic the answer to the issues that a lot of educators have been struggling to get people to understand?
It just might be. And it's so weird because, as I mentioned, COVID-19 isn't something we would consider to be a sexually transmitted disease. I mean, there are still things we don't know about, whether it can be transmitted through genital fluids. There have been some studies that have found COVID-19 present in the semen of men, but it's not something we classify as an STD, but it does seem to be having this spillover effect into how people are thinking about sex and how they're navigating sexual relationships. And so to the extent that this is the thing that prompts more condom use, prompts more discussions around sexual health, like that's ultimately a silver lining that comes out of all of this. But who could have guessed that at the very beginning?
I think it's hopeful that people are finding ways to navigate discussions around their boundaries. And that comes in the form of how are you social distancing or what is your COVID-19 status? And that lends itself so easily, I think, into the conversation around sexual health and around consent and boundaries. So being forced to have these awkward, tough conversations, I think is building a muscle memory in people that they didn't know was possible for them before. So Ev, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, Ev says, my name is Ev, and I'm personally passionate about sexual practices among Black and Latinx communities. My question is, throughout your research, have you encountered major similarities among Black and Brown sexual behaviors / practices and Anglo sexual behaviors and practices? And how does that shape any assumptions that you might be able to make about the research you might have made about COVID-19, sex, and Black and Brown communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when we start breaking down our data and doing subgroup analyses, we do see that there are some differences based on race and ethnicity of our participants, as well as on sexual identity of our participants. And one of the trends that we observed there was that racial minorities, as well as sexual and gender minorities, seem to be struggling more during the pandemic than their cis heterosexual white counterparts. Now, I think that part of the story there is that the racial minorities and sexual and gender minorities in our sample had elevated rates of living alone. And so there were higher rates of stress and loneliness that those groups were experiencing. And I think that that might have contributed partially to some of the disparities that we observed specifically in our data set. And when you start looking beyond our data set and talking about broader trends and things that were happening, the economic hit to racial minorities, to sexual and gender minorities was bigger in terms of how COVID-19 affected them economically. And you can also imagine that that's going to have spillover effects in terms of how that affects their intimate lives and relationships. So yeah, the rates of distress were higher for many of the minority groups that we studied last year. And it's a combined effect of the disproportionate economic impact and the disproportionate impact of stress.
Yes, and the disproportionate impact of health as well. More people in the Black and Brown communities were negatively impacted health-wise by the pandemic. I also want to say that this is an opportunity to not just ask questions, but to share any insights. So if anybody here has anecdotal insights that you want to share, if you work with certain communities, we would love to have your hand up and to give you an opportunity to share with everybody else. Again, we're all here together to try to pool as much information as possible from our various different pockets of expertise, create a consensus and idea, and of course, action points for how we can move forward and do our work better. Summer says, how can we connect the mental/emotional outcomes of COVID to sexual education? I wonder, how do we keep the positive trends going? So ride in the wave.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a great question. And something to think about here is to go back to that communication piece. How are people communicating about risk right now and navigating that in their daily interpersonal interactions, the interactions they're having online? And so what lessons can we take away from that in terms of how do we just teach people more generally how to improve their communication, right? Because sexual communication is partially a byproduct of just your overall communication patterns and how comfortable and confident you feel talking about things and asking questions and disclosing aspects of yourself and your personal history. And so I think there are lessons that we can draw from this that we can incorporate into the ways that we teach adolescents and young adults just about how to talk to one another, and especially about how to communicate about sexual health risks and so forth. And so I think this is a great opportunity to refocus on communication, education, and incorporate that into some of the training work that we do.
Carol brought up a great point that it's not just there's a billion different ways that people have experienced the pandemic. And it's fascinating because one person's experience the past 14 months can be completely different and it can be on the exact same street. But something that has made a big difference is where you live. So if you watch the news, somebody who lives in Atlanta can go to the gym and do a workout class and possibly go to a party. Whereas in other parts of the country, you could barely go to the grocery store without being stopped and questioned about where you're going. I'm in California, where only recently now have they said, if you're going for a walk, you don't need to wear a mask outside. So can we make any inferences about sexual behavior based on how strict the guidelines were, given where you live?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. And we do have international data. We have data from around the US, including zip code data. So we can do that fine grain level of analysis to look at how were the trends different in different areas based on what the lockdown restrictions were, based on what the rate of viral spread was in that area. We haven't quite gotten to the point yet of doing that fine level of analysis, but I know that there were drastic differences. And something that does speak to that is that when I looked at our data based on political affiliation, I saw that there were differences in the sexual behaviors of self-identified conservatives versus self-identified liberals. And what I saw was that self-identified liberals reported a much bigger negative impact on their sex lives than the conservatives. And we know that liberals and conservatives often live in different areas. And so, that speaks to that piece about how things were a little bit different. And so I think when we're talking about, what's going to happen in this year going forward, I think we're going to see a bigger trend toward change for liberal identified persons and also for people who live in bigger metropolitan areas where there were so many more restrictions in the beginning, right? But for the conservative individuals, those who are living in rural areas where there weren't as many restrictions, things didn't change as much. And so you're not going to see as much of a rebound in behavior for those groups of people. So I think, when we're talking about what the future holds, we really need to look at, well, what was the past in that particular area? And where there was a bigger impact overall, you're going to see a bigger rebound effect going forward.
Dr. Leigh Miller doesn't need me, obviously, because you're teeing yourself up for the next presentation. So that was a great segue.
Okay. All right. Well, let me share my last set of slides here and raise some provocative questions about what we need to think about going forward. So what will our sex and relationships look like in the future? And I think the really big question is, are these shifts going to be temporary, or are we seeing more fundamental long-term shifts in some of these areas? And that's what we really need to pay attention to going forward. So here are some of the important areas to watch, in my view. So when we're talking about the future of relationships, this pandemic has the potential to reset our living patterns. So if you look at US Census data, you see that the proportion of Americans living single has been on the rise since the 1970s. And in fact, the number of Americans living single has increased by more than 2/3 in the last half century. And according to 2010 census data, 27% of adult Americans are living alone. Curious to see what the 2020 data have to say about that, but we know that this has been on the rise for quite a long time. And the question is, will this trend begin to reverse because this pandemic has led people to reprioritize living with a partner, right? So whereas in the past, we may have celebrated adults living single and having more freedom and choice, are we going to see movement away from that? Also, we need to talk about marriages, right? So prior to the pandemic, the US marriage rate was at a record low. And people, in addition to shunning marriage, were waiting longer and longer to get married, with the average age of the first marriage creeping up to close to 30 in recent years. And so I'm curious as to whether this pandemic will also shift people's interest in getting married and also their interest in getting married at a younger age. So what are going to be the broader impacts on our living arrangements and also interest in marriage? Now, when we talk about the future of sex, there's a lot of interesting things to talk about here. On the one hand, we could certainly talk about that rise in sexual adventuresomeness that we noted in our data. And so will people be kinkier going forward? I would love to know the answer to that. But I know that for this particular audience, you're probably really curious about, what's the impact going to be on safe sex? And we know that condom use has been on the decline for years. Rates among teens and also among men who have sex with men have been dropping in particular over the last decade. But what we're seeing in some of our data is that willingness to use condoms is increasing. So will COVID-19 potentially blunt or reverse that trend toward lower condom use? That's a really important thing for us to pay attention to going forward. Maybe this is the thing we needed in a way to help promote safer sex. I think there's also a lot to be said about, what's going to happen to hookup culture, right? We've heard so much about hookup culture over the last couple of decades, but interestingly, at the same time as we're hearing about this rise in hookup culture, there's also been this rise in sexlessness among young adults. And in particular, when you look at 18 to 24-year-old men, 1 in 3 of them, and this was prior to the pandemic, said that they had not had sex in the past year. And that was a number that has risen significantly in the last couple of decades. So against the backdrop of hookup culture, you also have this rise in young adults who aren't having sex at all. And this pandemic has made it harder for people to have sex and hook up and so forth. And so what is going to be the implication of even higher levels of sexlessness among young adults? And, for example, there's a whole conversation you could potentially have there about incels, young men who aren't having sex and all of that. I don't know if we want to get into it, but just raising it as a point to think about. We also need to talk about the future of fertility. It's estimated that this year alone, there are going to be 300,000 to 500,000 fewer births than there would have been if COVID-19 hadn't happened. And this is really important because over the last decade, there's already been a substantial drop in births in the United States. So you already had declining birth rates, and now you've got this really significant decline on top of a decline. And so there are lots of questions to be raised there about what are the social implications of this, the economic implications, and the political implications, and whether or not the government needs to work on policy to try and promote more births and so forth. There's a lot to be discussed there. There's also a lot we don't know yet about, what is the overall impact of COVID-19 going to be on our reproductive health? And there's so many things, like I said, that we don't know, but I have seen some studies that point to impaired sperm counts in men who have been infected with COVID-19, perhaps due to an elevated immune response in the testes. We also know from some other studies that men infected with COVID, that this has also affected their testosterone levels, again, because there's this effect in the testes. And so there's a lot we don't know going forward and what that's going to mean for fertility. And then lastly, we also need to talk about the future of STIs, right? We know that rates of sexual activity dropped over the last year, but at the same time, STI testing and surveillance dropped as well. And so we literally don't know what happened with STIs over the past year. We do know that before COVID-19, several STIs were at record high rates. But since the pandemic began, what we're seeing in the research is that people who were asymptomatic, they aren't going in to get tested. So for example, when you look at research reports published featuring data based on STI clinics, for example, if you look at cases of gonorrhea, you're seeing a drop in new gonorrhea diagnoses overall, but you're not seeing a change in the number of symptomatic people showing up to those clinics, right? So gonorrhea cases are dropping, symptomatic cases are not dropping. What is dropping are the asymptomatic cases. So do you have a lot of asymptomatic infections out there that are spreading? And so you have this unknown STI epidemic that's happening at the same time as the COVID-19 pandemic. It's also worth noting that some research has found a decline in condom use during the pandemic. I know I said that people are more interested in using condoms going forward, but if you look at what happened over the last year, some studies, including our own Kinsey Institute data, show that particularly among singles, you actually saw a drop in condom use, which is something we also need to discuss here. You know, what does that conflicting data mean? People are more interested in using condoms, but they're using them less. How do we square those two things? I don't think we know the answer to it yet. You know, I think it's possible that maybe part of the drop in condom use last year was because, you know, you could look at that through the lens of terror management theory, and people were afraid about the prospect of their own mortality and what was going to happen, and they were kind of living for the moment. And so maybe that decreased safer sex behavior temporarily, but maybe it's going to shift going forward. We don't know. There's really just a lot we don't know yet. But I think we also need to discuss more broadly, how do we encourage folks to get back into the habit of STI testing? How do we make them feel safe and comfortable going back to their providers to get tested? So I know that's a lot to think about and a lot of questions, but let me turn it back over to Shannon.
Interesting, because it was such a wave going through this in the 3 different sections, because initially there's this like sadness of like, wow, this has been a really difficult year. And then there's this jubilation of like, well, it's been difficult, but there's been some positive impacts in our community. And then there's these questions that were like, oh yeah, you know, there's a lot of things that beforehand that we knew were issues, especially the sexlessness, and almost that be careful what you wish for with the younger generation. And then now you see that that could actually be something that we really have to lean into now going forward to ensure the health of our communities and especially of the youth communities. So I think that it was really great to put all this out there the way that you did, and the chat has been going crazy. So I definitely want to start there. And then again, encourage anybody, if you want to hands up and come on camera, we would love to see you too.
Yes, and thank you all for coming on this big emotional roller coaster with me.
All right, so Jessica, on the condom use topic said, could the drop in condom use be correlated to the increase in desire to commit and feeling it wasn't necessary? So people saying, I've only had one sexual partner. Yes, I should use condoms, but I don't have to because it's just been me and this one other person.
Yeah, and so it is possible that maybe we don't need to be quite as concerned about the drop in condom use because there were also other changes in sexual behavior patterns at the same time. So for example, Kinsey, in collaboration with Match.com, did another study last year looking at what was happening among singles in America. And one of the things they found was a rise in friends with benefits relationships and people hooking up with their roommates. And so people had sort of designated sex buddies during this period of time. So they were having casual sex, but we're not talking about one night stand casual sex. It's somebody with whom they have more intimacy and communication. And so if people are using condoms less with partners they feel safer with, and they're limiting their number of partners, then it might not be as concerning for overall sexual health. And I think the real question is, you know, what's going to happen going forward when typical patterns of casual sex resume, because we know that will happen at some point.
Carol had a reflection. Carol said that I follow prenatal tracking in our area, and pre-COVID, I would have at least 100 women. After COVID, my numbers are about 35 to 40. I think that's a really fascinating finding that you have, Dr. Lee Miller, because your point before, or as soon as COVID hit, we had all this talk about the baby boom and a second baby boom coming. And it's actually quite the opposite. Does this need to be making news more? Do we have to be talking about this a lot more? And to your point, like, is this something that we should be thinking about when we are organizing our ideas around policy making in the future?
Yeah, this is something I don't hear us discussing enough. You know, I heard the media headlines switch from baby boom to baby bust, but it's just kind of like, okay, so they're not going to have babies. But we need to talk about what are the bigger long-term impacts of all of this, and are those babies that are just never going to happen, or is it that people are delaying their reproductive decisions and so they're going to make up and have more kids later on? We don't know the answer to that, but we do know that at least temporarily this is going to result in smaller cohorts of children being born. So on the social side, you need to talk about, well, what are the impacts of a smaller cohort? Maybe that's more individualized attention. Maybe that helps those children to thrive but maybe smaller families contribute to more loneliness, right? So what are the potential good and bad things there? And then also the bigger picture going forward, what's the impact of the smaller workforce? Yes, it makes jobs easier to get, but you're going to be collecting less tax revenue, and you're going to have more threats to the solvency of Social Security, right? So you need to talk about the social and the economic implications all at the same time. We don't know what the answers are going to be, but we really need to be prepared to address them because this could have some really serious long-term impacts.
I want to give a shout out. Bill said, what a fantastic presentation, Dr. Leigh Miller. So, and I think everybody would second that. And there's some really incredible insights happening in the chat as well. Summer says, I think clinics may have some difficulty getting clients back in for testing birth control. Many clinics have had to close their doors to limit appointments because of COVID or focus on COVID testing instead of STI and STD testing. They had to think outside the box to still meet the sexual health needs of their clients. And now they are opening up again. Outreach is key. I would love some reflections on some of the outreach that people have been doing as, again, things are turning back to normal, to re-educate the population on come back, resume back to normal.
I would love to hear that as well. And just one point to add to that, I think this pandemic has shown us the real importance of telemedicine for sexual and reproductive health, right? When people can't go to their doctor's office, how can they still get STI tests by mail, or access birth control pills or contraceptives or the morning after pill? We need to talk more about how can we continue to ensure there aren't disruptions in continuity of care. And there were also impacts for a lot of men who have sex with men who were on PrEP, where they weren't able to access their medication or they weren't able to access HIV care, right? These are big issues we need to talk about going forward to ensure that sexual and reproductive health is protected during very challenging periods of time like this.
And Carol had a great insight too, that this also, the lack of schools closing and public spaces closing also meant lack of availability to free condoms for a lot of people. Also resulted in the decline. So Susan had a great thought starter here. Building on the COVID trends, what are the challenges for sexual health messaging and service delivery? I would love for everybody in the chat to kind of chime in on that one. I think it's a great thought starter. I'll say it again. So building on the COVID trends, what are the challenges for sexual health messaging and service delivery?
Just building on that, this is Jen. I'm just also wondering, Justin, you were mentioning how, telehealth, and I thought of that right away in terms of access, and if the clinics are closed or there's limited appointments, how there has been, we've seen especially in other fields, a real boon in telehealth, right? And so I'm just wondering, if folks on the call also have any experience with young people in telehealth and with sexual and reproductive health, if that is an opening because they feel like they can do it from their phones, or is there confidentiality issues? I just don't know how young people are interacting with telehealth for these sensitive issues, and I'd love to know if anybody has any experience with that, or if you've heard anything either. I think we're really curious to see how that plays out, and as we think about the future and the future of sexual health services, what that might mean.
Yeah.
I've had a new birth control prescribed to me, telehealth, and I've used apps. I know people who have credit cards and access to credit cards and are over 18 have been able to switch and make some really great necessary changes to utilize your phone to have a lot of your sexual health needs met. And I've been surprised at how easy it's been, but I definitely would love to hear people who work with those who are under 18.
Yeah, I don't have any data to share on that because our studies were all limited to adults. But if anyone has any insights on what was happening with adolescents and sexual health, we'd be very curious to know.
Maybe I see a study in our future.
That would be great. Yes.
Someone actually brought up a great point about the impacts of social media on the youth in particular. So you get this idea via social, like right now we're getting the pseudo impression that we are together and that we are communing, which we are, but it doesn't replace in person. And of course, when it comes to intimacy, nothing can really replace the in-person. I think that the youth are now deprioritizing connections because they do have social media to get some semblance of community.
Oh, that's such a fascinating question. You know, and certainly there was a lot more technological engagement, a lot more social media engagement. I know I saw a lot more Instagram and Twitter outages in the last year than I typically see in a year. And I think there are lots of interesting things to talk about with regard to, you know, so what happened on social media over the last year, and what were the good things and what were the bad things. And we did see people using it to build more connections and build more intimacy with other people. But at the same time, when we're talking about sex specifically, we also saw this rise in shaming behavior, sexual shaming that occurred over the last year. You know, people being shamed for having sexual needs, for pursuing casual sex, for continuing to date during the pandemic. We also saw on Instagram the gays over COVID phenomenon, where people were being outed and shamed for having casual sex, and being on dating and sex apps during the pandemic. And so, you know, you have this interesting rise of sex shame that happened over the last year. And that's compounded on top of, you know, we already have a lot of shame around sex to begin with. And so that served to push a lot of the discussions and conversations about sex underground. So as much as we're talking about increased communication, openness, like that's also happening at the same time as this rise in shame and, you know, pushing these conversations underground. So what's the overall impact of all of that going to be as we come out of this? It's a question I don't have the answer to.
One question that I think, or one thought starter that I think is something that we should all be mulling over, and I would love to get your thoughts on this. When we think about how do we talk about what matters most to the public, what are the key messages if prior to the pandemic, we were really focused on the STI boom and the resurgence of old STIs that had now recently come back. And it was trying to challenge people on their libertine way of dating and trying to think of intimacy more holistically. Obviously, consent was a really big topic that was being pushed in 2018 and 2019. Now that we're in 2021, if we want to talk about what matters most to people in this space, what do you think are the major tentpoles?
Oh my gosh, such a big question. And there's so many important things. So I think it's a continuation of a lot of the things that you mentioned. You know, heightened focus on consent and communication, and also on sexual health and STIs, right? All of those things are super important. And at the same time, we also still need to have continued discussions around sexual violence and domestic violence. And, you know, there's also been some research finding an uptick in domestic violence during the pandemic. Also, I've seen some reports of increased child abuse during the pandemic as well. And so I think we need to talk about, you know, what are the implications of people spending more time at home and having all these social restrictions, and, you know, what are the implications for violence in the home happening? And so how do we address all of that going forward? You know, this pandemic has had so many complex effects, some for better, some for worse. And we really need to be talking about, you know, what are the lessons we can learn from this, take away from it. And I think the communication and consent is one of those keys, but also what were the struggles and challenges, and how do we help those people who were really hurt and struggling or victimized during this past year as well.
I think you did an incredible job of utilizing this pandemic to share such important information. And I have been plugged into your page, and many people, like, and as I know you mentioned this previously, that your media requests are completely through, are trying to figure this out. So how do other people who are in this industry take advantage of the heightened awareness that is happening and the increased conversations? And again, kind of how should that impact messaging?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that we can use from all of this as a teaching tool. And again, I think it's looking at what are the good things that came out of this? How did this increase and improve communication skills? And how do we take that and just help people going forward to build the tools they need to navigate happier and healthier sex lives and relationships? So for all of the struggles and challenges we've endured, I think there's really a lot that we can take away from this in terms of lessons going forward to really strengthen our sex lives and relationships, build deeper intimacy with partners, and have better, more pleasurable and safer sex.
I want to just second Bill right now and say, Dr. Lynn Miller, what a fantastic presentation. I think there is so much to think about, and I believe everyone's going to have access to the slides, because I think that these are things that you've got to mull over out what's going to work best for you and your community going forward. And in speaking of the future, what are some of the things that you are working on? And is there ways that people here can help to contribute in the fantastic work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm actually gearing up to conduct my own nationally representative survey of what is happening during uh, what is happening in our sex lives and relationships right now as we go into the summer, because we know that in summer there tends to be this peak in sexual behavior and activity when we look historically. And so what is this summer going to look like? And in particular, I'm really curious about what is the impact of vaccination on sexual behavior. So for example, do people who are vaccinated do they develop a sense of invincibility or invulnerability? And will that increase sexual risk taking? Or will people still be more cautious when it comes to approaching sex and relationships? So I also want to look at some of the sort of bigger questions about how did this change our psychology around relationships. So for example, do people believe more in the idea of a soulmate now than they did before this pandemic began, right? Because like we talked about, this has led to a reprioritization of commitment. And so maybe there's actually heightened belief in this idea that there's one right person who's out there for you, and people are going to be focused more on finding that, right? And so I'm curious to really explore broader changes in our psychology and also what's happening with vaccinations and how that's impacting sexual behavior. So if you have ideas for questions that you might like to see on that survey or thoughts, things that we should take into account, please shoot me an email. I'm at drleemiller@gmail.com, or feel free to connect with me on social media and slide into my DMs.
I think it's so fascinating that this pandemic has caused people to prioritize the things that you think about when you're like, oh, when I get much older, like what's going to happen to me if I get sick? Who's going to look after me? And that used to be a question that people would only think applied to their senior and their golden years. But now I've seen people who are 18 years old say to me, like, I don't know what I would have done if it wasn't for my romantic partner who looked after me during those 2 weeks that no one could see me at all. So now even that, like, what are you going to do when it's just the two of you alone at home together? And that feels like a question for decades from now. And then now you've got young people having to have those exact same challenges. And so it's been interesting overall. I think that's the perfect way to describe this talk. Thank you so much to Dr. Leigh Miller for the work that you do. And again, I want to encourage everybody, I'm going to slide in your DMs because I have some thought starters, and maybe just to say thank you once again. I want to bring back Jen and Susan to give some closing remarks and to take us home.
Thank you so much, Shan and Justin, for another incredibly insightful and thought-provoking presentation, and to our members for being so actively engaged. You've given us a lot to think about. Justin, I think you did a great job wrapping some of those themes up, but I'll mention a few that I think are really relevant to the coalition as we think about our work moving forward. Also, I want to say your research is so interesting. I feel like we could have spent the entire day with you talking about this and massaging it. And every time you start talking about something new, you add a new element to the data that I think is super fascinating. So we really appreciate you sharing your data with us and your thoughts, and also Shan, for you sharing all of your insights and provocative questions. So as I listened today, there were some themes that came up for me that I think are really important for us to think about moving forward. I think the first is it's clear that many people are seeking more intimate, high quality and committed relationships. So it seems like this is a great time to really ramp up our messaging around positive relationships. We've done a lot of work in that area, but can we talk about what is a positive relationship, how to build one, and not just person to person, but also through online dating. And I think, Justin, you brought out some really interesting trends around online dating. The other thing I don't want to miss is that people want pleasurable and satisfying sex lives. And I think we learned a lot from this about how people can really achieve that through experimentation, innovation, trying new activities. So it also strikes me that this might also be a really great time to leverage that and increase the conversation around pleasure and what that means for people. The other thing I think we're seeing, hopefully, more open conversations around COVID. What are people's COVID behaviors? What are they doing? What is risk? And this has come up several times, but how can we build on those open conversations and broaden them to include consent, desire, safer sex, and STIs? I think the other thing is as people are starting to feel more freedom, going back and getting healthcare services, how can we remind people about the importance of things like STI screening, contraception, and other services that are important to them. And Justin, as you said, that they are comfortable and they are safe being in a healthcare setting. And I think the last point I want to make is thinking about those healthcare delivery options. And a lot of us have seen data that have seen that people are not getting HIV care and treatment. They're not on PrEP. They might not be on birth control. They're not getting screened for STIs. And I don't think as a community, we want to accept the fact that just because we have a pandemic, that all of a sudden those staff and resources are being shifted to fight obviously a very important issue. But the flip side is that people are suffering in other aspects of their health. And so I think we want to think about that moving forward. So it's a lot to chew on. I think as a coalition, we'll start thinking about these things, talking about them in the healthcare action groups and the communications action group, and see what we might want to do in terms of messaging and activities moving ahead. Before we wrap up today, and I know we're at time, we would love your feedback on this first open forum. It's really important to us. It's the first time we've done this. There will be a link to the survey in the chat. It will take you less than a minute probably to complete it. So we would greatly appreciate your feedback. And as Jen mentioned, you can also mention other topics you're interested in moving forward that we can address. So again, I would like to thank you, Justin and Shan, for a great session. Now that we know you're doing a third survey, Justin, I don't know, we might be calling you again. But anyway, thanks to everyone for joining us today, and we hope that you stay healthy and well. Bye-bye.